usually singing, dancing, or whatever. I've got this cough that every time I try to get too excited, it kind of goes crazy. So let's see if we can keep it constrained today. So my first thanks actually goes to Reddy, who fixed my typo on the Greek spelling of the word Pythagoras. That's what you get for letting a Caribbean person, use Greek words. So thank you, Reddy. And I do want to acknowledge right off the bat that this work is really the joint effort of Adam Toubé and I, and Adam's in the back. Just everyone say hi to Adam. And Adam is I don't want to oversell it, but he's phenomenal. And he has been just the ideal research partner in this at Semaphore. He's a postdoctoral researcher here at the iSchool for Semaphore. And we've done some really fabulous things. So what I'm going to talk about today, staying with the traditional format, since this is my third round of here doing this just junior professor research day, is talk a little bit about where I am currently in my research trajectory, and then I'm going to go on to actually talk about a paper that Adam and I just recently wrote and aimed high and submitted to CHI, which has a 9.8% acceptance rate, but we're going for it, and we'll see what comes from that. Right, Kelly? You gotta try.
You gotta try.
You gotta
You gotta be in it to win it.
That's right. So I cheekily called this presentation. Yeah, I cheekily called it, "What if Pythagoras had a digital tablet in kindergarten?" And basically what I'm teeing up here is this idea that we're introducing these devices into elementary schools and schools right across the spectrum. But we wanted to understand, if we took an information and a sort of cognitive psychology approach and combined those efforts, what could it teach us about what is actually happening when we put this in front of children? I picked Pythagoras for two reasons. Clearly, I remember Pythagorean theory, but mainly because Pythagoras did offer a geometrical approach, which has to do with understanding structures. And as you look at people use tablet devices, it kind of calls to mind some of those structures. Also because Adam's area of expertise is in mathematics and cognition of mathematics. So we actually built the study leveraging his immense work in the area of math and children, and we are using that in the study. So I'll take you through how that's working out. So first, in my research, I'm taking a sensory approach to user-device interactions. This actually was born a lot from the work that I presented 2 years ago when I looked at the use of tablet devices by nonverbal autistic children. And what came from that study were some of the things that really sparked this idea to move it into another area. So my research really focuses on interactions among users and new media technologies, but with a particular emphasis on the influence of sensory perception, on information interpretation, and information use. And here's where we can kind of see the combination and how I'm trying to connect theoretically to some information concepts. So over the past few years, I've pursued this goal of looking at sensory approaches, particularly the area of touch, in three trajectories. The first has really been an investigation of socio-cognitive effects of using touch input devices in educational settings. The second trajectory looks at analyzing social consequences of everyday information practices and engagement with new media. So that's when I do work that includes things further afield, like Facebook and so on and so on. The third is really to try and build some theoretical pieces, some inquiry into the notion of entanglement that really captured me when I did my PhD dissertation. And of course, really working off of work done by scholars like Orlikowski and Barad and Suchman, who talked about the co-constitution and the entanglement process when users engage with technologies. But what I want to do is go a little bit further, and I'm trying to create an intersection theoretically between information practice, which Savolainen has spent his career building, and other kinds of notions around what is it about entanglement, what is actually happening, why is it happening. So I need to go a little deeper. And to do that, Brett talked about his areas, really socio-technical structures, sort of external structures. I'm becoming more interested in the internal structures. So what's actually happening inside? What's happening in the way that we process information that makes that entanglement happen? And when people talk about addiction, technology, and so on, what are the things about the way that we manipulate that information in our mental models and in our schemas internally that is leading to that sort of observation? Now, to do that, my engineering background and my sociology background help a teeny bit, but what's missing clearly if you're going inside the head is somebody who understands cognition. And that's where Adam comes in. I recently presented similar, not the same thing, it's something as an extension somewhere, and I used all these psych words, and at the end, a couple of the academics in the room came up and said, so where did you do your psychology? And I said, I didn't. This is the School of Adam debate if you're listening to it. And whenever I talk about these things, when we get to a point where you really need to know, we're going to defer to Adam on some of the really crazy stuff. All right, so one of the things that we were interested in is really this notion about sensory perception. In HCI, a lot of the work is often done on the interface, right? And I'm trying to go, as I said, inside the interface. So look at things like cognitive effects. That includes looking at device affordances, communication, what is actually communication, how is that working, and also then the social implications of all of that. So, as I said before, my long-term interest is to connect this notion that information is not just really about objects. And when Savalainen in practice talks about information use, we tend to think of it in terms of use of this thing called information that we can touch, their artifacts or documents and so on, but also to see information as a process, right? And that there's actually another side of information use that has to do with the way that we process, and that's kind of the extension that I'm building through this research. So, so in a nutshell, I can say that my research focuses on interactions among users and new media, the emphasis on sensory perception and information use. And I'm going to talk about a project that Adam and I, we're at phase one, just finished one, we're about to kick off. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to make a call to ask for your help. So wait for that cliffhanger. So children's use of educational applications on tablet devices, we're interested in the influence of sensory perception on information interpretation in the area of learning. So what I'm going to actually do is play for you this little ad, and these are I didn't pick any particular one. I just want to show you what's the rhetoric from the developers' side of the fence.
Introducing I Learn With, an innovative education program for young children. Designed exclusively for touchscreen tablets, I Learn With features fun games, engaging rewards, and unique tools for parents to follow the learning progress. I love to see Olivia having so much fun with the I Learn With apps. They're just games to her, but I can see her learning. I know Olivia will be ready for school, as I see her building essential skills in math, reading, and science. And I like how the games adapt as her abilities grow. I can see Olivia's progress and compare it with children the same age. I Learn With even creates a personalized learning path for her and suggests which skills are appropriate to learn next. Olivia loves to collect rewards each time she achieves a new learning goal. She gets to play with her rewards in the Planet Boing app. It looks so much fun. I wish I was a kid again. I Learn With, a fun new way to get ready for school, one app at a time.
Right. So the general rhetoric there, sense of rhetoric there, really hold on that parental fear, get your kid ready for school. A lot of what was interesting and why I picked this particular one, we didn't actually study this particular one, but it does kind of reflect in general on what we saw. This notion that the child sits alone for most of the engagement, and the child is learning, learning to read, and some of the other ads they'll come in and they'll say, oh, look, honey, Olivia's reading. And the parents are by the doorway, and there's that kid just with the tablet, just learning away. And so one of the things we wanted to know is, what's actually going on here? Like, and what we realized when we did the background on this is that although a lot of people are talking about this, and over the last 5 to 6 years, companies are really drilling into child-specific tablet devices and applications, what we started to say is that people aren't actually studying what's going on here. So that our first stance, our first position was, is this what actually is happening or is something else happening? And then we phased out the project to understand how could we look at that from various aspects of sensory engagement. So in the first place, what we wanted to just know is to what extent are tablet devices an effective way of communicating academic material to children, right? And we actually wanted to take them out of the home setting and look at them in a more neutral setting. So we're looking at them in school. Now I'm saying neutral, so we're not looking at them in the classroom, and I'll explain that in a second. We're actually taking them out of the classroom in one-on-one interactions and observing what they do. So Adam and I were intrigued by sort of the deficit in the literature and by advertisers' claims regarding the potential of these devices as learning tools for young users. So we decided to check into that. I conducted a longitudinal study earlier on autistic children. From that, three things, major things came out of that. The first is that we saw an increase in engagement by the children in non-tablet related classroom activities, but that were sort of fueled through the tablet. The second thing we saw was improved communication skills and acquisition, and we saw an increase in motivation to use these devices in general. Those were children with sort of cognitive, some people call it disabilities, some people call it abilities. We wanted to look at what would a neurotypical population look like, non-autistic children. Do they show the same kinds of things? So one of the things I saw in previous study is that the applications on the tablets provide rich, consistent feedback to children, such that inputting a correct response consistently results in a combination of visual, auditory, and haptic feedback. Also, that the application only requests responses from the children that they can reliably reproduce. So that was another piece that we looked at. The third was that the application is able to capture and maintain that attention. So we decided to fold that into what we're doing now. The other part of this is that this is the title of I didn't use Pythagoras for the actual Chi paper. This is the Chi paper titled Hyper Help and Information Cognitive Psychology Study of Tablet Computer Use by K through Grade 2 Children. I wanted to try and see how I could pull communication/information theory in, and we went at it. Adam and I looked at lots of things. Earlier today we heard Fiorella talk about distributed cognition and computing and situated learning, and we looked at many of those things, and we narrowed down to Nicholas Luhmann's piece, sort of treatise on communication. What is communication? That he wrote for communication theory in 1992. We used Luhmann's framework to create a project where we could examine that interaction and the implications of the interactions that arise when children use mathematical applications. We decided also to try different types of devices. So we came up with 4. We used the LeapPad, we used the InnoTab. Those are 2 of the more popular devices, and those are built for children devices. We also then chose to look at devices in terms of the hardware that was not built for children. So we looked at, of course, the iPad, and we also looked at an Android tablet, and we used the Acer in this case. And we then took 3 apps per device, and Adam did a ton of work trying to figure which ones we would use, and we used these for the study. So in terms of looking at Luhmann, not yet. Okay, not yet. I'll come back to Luhmann. How did we design it? We had 36 children, as I said, kindergarten through grade 2. equal representation of boys and girls. As in all the studies that I do, it requires going through several, or maybe two, sets of research ethics. So we go through the UT ethics, and then we also go through TDSB ethics. We have to get police clearance checks because we're going into these schools, so we get all that stuff. And here's a picture of Adam that I took because I didn't have my police clearance yet, so I couldn't actually touch or speak to the children. So I had to stand at the back and take one picture of Adam working. So what we, in a typical scenario, we got parental consents, informed consents through, and then we would take the children out of the classroom for a specified period of time, sign them out into this room that we had designated for our research project. You can see a camera on a tripod set up there, a lot of video coding. Most of our work, we did the analysis based on the video coding. And then Adam's there, doing his researcher thing, guiding the child. The child is facing the device. We give very little instruction on what they should do. Take the device and give them some parameters. Adam also ran some working memory tests with the children so that we could do some checks on the actual child and their cognitive ability. So we did some working memory things there. In terms of measures, we looked at child-tablet communication. So I should have put the Lumen stuff first, but I'll explain to you what it is. Lumen's framework, basically he suggests that communication itself, actually I can forward to it. What do I do with it? Throw it out. Okay, I shall read it for you. So Lumen offered a definition of communication that basically talks about three things. Now, Lumen used his for large-scale social systems theory, right? So here I'm kind of cribbing it into a very micro scale, so we see how this scales. For Lumen, communication is emergent and self-reflexive process. It involves three forms of encounters with information or content. First, there has to be a selection of information. So that's the first part for Lumen. So information is selected somehow. The second is that there's a selection of an utterance of the information. And then the third is this idea that there has to be understanding or a misunderstanding of the utterance and its information. Now, utterance was relevant, of course, to Lumen. This is pre-touch technology. So we have interpreted utterance in our case to actually think about the touch input gesture as the actual thing that we're looking at. So we kind of reinterpreted that. And we're interested here in understanding those things. What is being selected as a communication? What is actually being understood or misunderstood? And by doing that, we're looking at gestures as the way to get to that. So I'll get to that. So measures then, child-tablet communication. We first looked at the information selected for communication. And this is really how what did the developers decide to choose as the way to communicate with this child? What is the interaction? What's at the core there? The second had to do with information transmission, which is the gesture request or the gesture performed, right? So if we're looking at this communication between the device and the child, what then is the actual way that information is getting transmitted via the gesturing? The second measure, the big measure we looked at, is this notion of understanding. How do we know that understanding is taking place? In a large way, what we did is we looked at whether the gesture requested was the gesture performed. Okay, so if you were asked to do this particular thing, if you understood that's what you were supposed to have done, did it match in the end? And the third, we were interested in this notion of engagement. Lumen goes on to say that in a communicative encounter, that you know that the encounter is a successful encounter if there's prolonged engagement. And I was connecting this to the first studies that I did where I looked at engagement and time spent and motivation. So in terms of the variables we looked at were time used, goal-directed use, and enjoyment. And we measured enjoyment in two ways, both the affect that the researcher could see from the child and also asking the children what they enjoy. So what we found, this isn't the right one. Anyway, I had some charts that are not here. So what we found were a few things. The first is that developers across the 4 platforms have focused more on creating applications that practice math than actually teach math. And I might actually just escape and load this because the graphs are really good. Yay. Look at me here while it loads. Okay, there we go.
Now you can dance.
Yeah, you dance. Kelly, dance. Okay, good. Here we go. So this is when you preload your presentation and then you make changes. All right. Here we go. So in this first sort of graph, we're looking at the proportion of time used. We're looking at the learning mechanic here. So the first instruction math. So what was math actually being taught? In the apps that we looked at, it was a very small amount of the time towards teaching math. Next, instruction use, which basically is teaching the children how to use it. And there were some really interesting apps that we thought were interesting that the kids did not find interesting, by the way. Things like number line, which were perfect for a tablet because you could do the zooming and the pinching and the fancy stuff. And they would have to show the children how to do that. Very little of that. Mainly it was tap. Just tap this thing. Move, drag it, tap it, drag it, tap it. That's all they did. Exploration. Let children just explore the notion of mathematics through various ways of doing that. No, not so much. Basically, all these apps are allowing children to practice already assumed knowledge about mathematics. Okay, so your children shall learn all this math. Your children shall practice all the math that your teacher in school or you have already taught them, right? That's what we're actually seeing in reality. In the other case here, we looked at gesture. So this was interesting to me because I want to see the communication here. So here we have the 4 devices: the blue, the iPad, the red, the icon tab, the green leapfrog, and the purple tab. And what we basically saw is very similar. They were very similarly branded. In terms of agreement, what the device requested is actually what the child responded to. So when people talk about this sort of native understanding that children seem to have with these devices, there is some evidence here that what is being requested is actually what they are able to interpret and understand and respond to accurately. There were cases of child error, and the iPad was slightly higher, but really across the board it was pretty low. And in terms of tablet error, when the tablet didn't understand what the child was actually inputting, there were some cases of that as well. So it happened in both cases, but generally speaking, there was gesture agreement, which tells us something about understanding. So then what we come away with is this notion that apart from practice, the emphasis of the applications that we saw was not to actually gamify. So that little ad, and we saw, oh, look at the rewards, and ping, ping, and look, it's a game, and people doing all that, once it's on a tablet, once it's an app, we've gamified learning. We actually saw very little gamification of mathematics, maybe because math is not funny. I don't know, maybe people don't find it gameable, but it should have been. It was more of a traditional pedagogy, right? So it's basically replicating, in the early days, I was trying to, I can't remember these early days, when they wheel the TV into these classrooms, and then basically it'd be a teacher doing the exact same thing that the teacher would do in the room. So why use this medium if you're not using anything else about the medium, right? We saw very little use of things like tilt, right? Zoom. It was basically like a flashcard that was kind of glitzy and pretty expensive, actually. So we saw very little attempt to do that. Looking at from a developmental cognitive psychology side, when we look at reinforcement, it was all like positive reinforcement. It was like went right off the scale. It was all yay, or you win a badge, and it was, so it's a very narrow paradigm for what is being done on these devices so far. And one of many points in this third one I'll describe with you is that there was a very low degree of diversity in really taking advantage of those affordances of the tablet. They may as well have been on a desktop computer. Really, there was no other value to doing this. And so, to some extent, we're saying that these are early days where we do see some hype. I also earlier said that we chose math because of Adam's expertise, but it's also because for early learners, exposure to language is a lot more difficult, early language, or in places like Toronto where you have English as a first language issue and so on, we knew we could come in at the K level and numbers would be something that would be more or less uniform. I didn't describe the working memory results and so on, but we could talk about that if you're interested. Just to end it off here, what we did conclude is that while yes, there seems to be some connection between the way we think children just get this stuff, it also suggests to us that the basis of the ease with which children are getting this kind of interaction has to do with the narrow range of gestures being requested. Right? It's easy because they've super simplified it. They're not doing very complex interactions. We did find that we were very successfully able to shrink Lumen down and really consider this in terms of information selected, in terms of information transmitted, and to get at the notion of understanding. So we feel very encouraged by that. Our next step requires some help from faculty. So here's my pitch. We have two other studies that are about to kick off. The first one involves adults. So we actually need adults who this is where we're doing a lot of our eye tracking work. We are looking at some work on cognitive load. And for us to do that, we have some theories that we're building around germane load, which is all Sweller stuff, and extraneous load, all this fancy stuff that's on the device. Is that where people are looking? Is that where that information is coming into? Where are they looking on the screen? So we did want to look at adult users. Adam tried unsuccessfully to get access to the psychology pool, because there is a pool of students that do research in psych. They said, thanks for coming. We have our own researchers. You go get yours somewhere else. So what we need actually, and I might be pitching this more formally to Seamus, is to create our own pool where researchers, when we need people to participate, there's an active pool. But what I will be doing is writing a lot of you who have classes here and asking you if we can think about giving an extra credit or something to have our students in the iSchool participate in this kind of research. I think it's important, and I think that us having to go to other places in the campus to find participants is rough. So that's one. Two, the next study we're going to kick off is in another school, again using the eye trackers, and we're going to focus that on looking at the sensory inputs coming in visually and auditorily with the children. And are we doing the sensors? I can't remember, skin conduction?
No, we're not adding that extra layer.
Okay, fine. So we're going to stick with auditory and visual, and that's our study that we're about to kick off in our second school. Thank you. Here, please.
You pronounce my name properly.
See, I'm Greek at heart.
Not Pythagoras.
There you go.
It's not Python.
Pythagoras.
Anyway, I have two questions. You mentioned at the beginning about math and cognitive science, and so what is this math? What's the, is it the math that you use to evaluate the technique, or is it the mathematics that the children are learning through the tablet? That I understood, but do you involve somehow, or do you have some indexes that you use to evaluate?
The results of the,
yeah.
we did a lot of statistical analysis, kind of math, a lot of ANOVAs, a lot of one direction, bi-direction, some regression work. So that's in the paper, and I don't think anybody's that one can have out here. But we are looking at the kids. I know you are here.
I mean, that's why I'm upset.
I know, here. Very please. Let's spend another 10 minutes.
But yeah, the question is, you evaluate that using some.
The basis of it is, you see, this is what happens when you do interdisciplinary work with someone from psychology. Like they're unable to not do statistical analysis. So I did it. No, I do this one. So, Adam, do you want to add anything to that on math?
I guess the only clarification point I would make is that were you asking whether or not we evaluated children's understanding of mathematics, or whether or not we used statistical analysis to interpret results?
I'd like to understand both, yeah, so what's the math that the students are exposed to?
Joe,
But-
in terms of, we did not evaluate children's understanding of mathematics. The focus here was to understand whether or not the children knew how to interact with the device, whether they properly communicated with it. Trying to engage in a 20-minute session with a child uses a tablet, and then they practice something for maybe 10 minutes, and then you try to do an assessment afterwards. It's not necessarily a good framework. Trying to see if that's going to increase their understanding of some addition or subtraction. So we were really curious about whether or not their interaction with the tablet, were they successful in that? And the educational content was mathematics, but we were evaluating their ability to use the device.
But it's tricky, right? Because we started the research thinking, could we look at the efficacy of learning math, right? Using the tablets. And, you know, in all of our discussions, what we realized is that's a whole other part of the research. That first, actually, I'm more interested in this part of it, and Adam was as well. But for sure, we could see that as future work from what we're doing, that you could go on to do that kind of analysis.
Can I have a small follow-up?
Yeah.
So if you replace math with something else, and tablets with devices like the lip motion where you don't tap and you don't interact with the screen,
Yeah.
but you interact with, like you move your hands. It's like, is this something that, I don't know?
That we could do in the future?
Yeah, or,
For sure, we could. But what I think is, even when you look at those apps, I mean, I spent a lot of time looking at the apps, those are very few. In 1 out of our 12 apps, you could blow. And it was only one device that allowed you to do, you could blow, and, you know, it was really an auditory cue to the device, but it would make a change to what was, mainly, it was tap and drag. Mainly. Even though those were available functions and available affordances, it wasn't really exploited. Yep.
I really would be interested in the larger question. There's a lot of chatter about rewiring the brain with digital reading, digital devices, whatever. And I'm wondering whether that's actually true. I know there's some work in the psychology department here and various one of these days maybe I will do it, but whether that's actually true and if it's a good thing. I mean, I just noticed from my own experiences having gone through revolutions. I mean, I've actually learned my mathematics tables.
Yeah, right.
But I was still of the generation when we did that, and I cannot now, sometimes I really have to think hard, and if I don't have my calculator with me, I have to really stop. And so I just wondered, I mean, it's just a very personal thing, obviously, but if the kids are so totally dependent on a digital device, and what happens when the power fails? What happens if, you know, like how good is, how effective is it in terms of learning? I mean,
Right.
in terms of where you're going now. But in a larger sense, and do you see yourself getting to that question?
Well, one of the
When
things that
there's this
we,
rewiring, what does that mean as of the things?
one of the things we're looking at is mental models, like, and sort of schemas, and how schemas are created. And what, when we, as I said, we're going into cognitive load now, and you're looking at working memories, what can you take in here, and what can you use to do that? That's why we did a whole bunch of work on the working memory parts of it. So is there rewiring? I mean, Adam, I know we don't use that language, but you get the gist, right?
Oh, okay. If one of the projects that we're working on that's just starting off is looking at, because the gestures are so simple, just a tap versus a drag, you need to be rather innocuous. But there's other work that's showing that it actually, when you physically interact with educational content, changes how you internally represent. So we're doing one project here, which is one of the adult ones that we need people to enroll in, is that in one condition they're going to be tapping a basic mathematics task. And the mathematics task itself is this continuous type of understanding of numbers, whereas tapping is very discrete. In the other condition, we're going to have a dragging interaction, which is a continuous interaction, and it's going to be, again, it's the same task, so it's a continuous mathematics topic. I'm curious, we're curious, if how they're using this as drag versus a tap, very innocuous thing, actually changes how they mentally represent this simple mathematics concept. So effectively, not rewiring the brain, but changing their schema and how they organize that idea. And it would be pretty amazing if how you touch content, the way in which you physically interact with it does change if you think about that content. So that's one of the things we're doing.
Yes.
I know there are a lot of people who ask questions, but because Andy hasn't asked them
Yes.
today, but
Yeah.
think it's a
Lumen.
really interesting choice, and what I'm wondering is, what other theories did you have to throw out in
Yeah.
favor of him?
But we haven't
Because-
thrown them out completely.
Well, yeah, but I mean,
Deferred them for.
exactly,
for the
so
future.
what pieces from other theories did you want to address with this that you
Yeah.
didn't have the time to?
Well, I mean, the big piece that I want to address is information practice.
Yeah.
Right? You know, we've talked about this, Andy, like it's okay at the 10,000 foot level, but when you're trying to do this stuff, there's no material to work with.
Yes.
So trying to really extend that and looking at it from device affordance, but also from what's happening in the brain. To do that, then we start getting into some outside stuff. And
Yes.
so we are looking at theories there. A lot of educational psychology theory too, from people like Sweller, people that we're bringing in as well. And I don't know, this idea about distributed cognition, it kind of has to do with what you were saying, or like what's being done on the device and what's happening, what parts of the mental models are happening in the person. We don't know how far we'll get there. I only have one more year, madam. He's going to be snapped up. But thank you very much for the input.
Thanks, Rob.